The knock came at 10 minutes past midnight, 3 raps so light that Emmerich Halbrook almost slept through them, and when he opened the door into a wall of blowing snow, he found not a lost calf or a stranded rider, but 3 children standing on his porch, with their arms wrapped around each other like the only warmth left in the territory. The oldest, a girl of 11 with her father's coat swallowing her to the knees, spoke first. "Please, mister, we won't be any trouble. We just need someplace warm till morning." Emmerich Halbrook had lived alone at the edge of Palisade Bend, Idaho Territory, for 6 years, ever since his wife Ada had died peacefully in her sleep of a wasting fever the winter after their first crop came in. And in all that time, he had built a single hard rule for himself out of the wreckage of that loss. Nobody who knocked on his door in weather like this would ever be turned away. He had made that promise to himself the night after Ada's burial, kneeling in the barn with the lantern gone cold, and he had kept it through 6 winters without once being tested past a stranger needing a meal or a horse needing a stall. He was tested now. "Get in here," he said, and stood back from the door, and that was the whole of the decision, though neither he nor the children yet understood how permanent a decision it was. Their names were Hattie, 11, who spoke for the other 2 the way the oldest child of a family that has lost everything learns to speak. Dashiell, called Dash, 8, silent and watchful, who flinched when Emmerich reached too quickly for the poker, and Nell, 4, who had stopped crying somewhere on the road and had not yet started again, which worried Hattie more than the crying would have. Their father, Corin Hadley, a journeyman blacksmith who had chased work from camp to camp since their mother Dorothea died peacefully in childbed with Nell, had himself died 3 weeks earlier of a lung fever that took him quietly in his sleep in a boarding house in a played-out silver camp 40 miles east. The camp's other families, themselves down to their last dollars, had done what they could: a week of shared meals, a coat handed down, a ride as far as the fork in the road, and then the children had walked the rest of the way alone, following a rumor that a rancher near Palisade Bend sometimes hired drifters and never asked hard questions. Emmerich was not, strictly, that rancher, but he built up the fire anyway and set water to boil, and by the time the sky had gone from black to gray, he had decided, without quite deciding, that these 3 would not be walking anywhere else. He did not yet know that his decision would put him against a circuit judge with a rule of his own, one written in a grief 30 years old. The weeks that followed had the shape of a season turning. Hattie took to the kitchen the way a person takes to the one thing that still makes sense, scrubbing his neglected stove until it shone, and in the evenings she read aloud from the one book in the house, a worn almanac, in a voice that made even the weather report sound like a story worth hearing. Dash did not speak much, but he watched Emmerich mend a bridle one evening, and the next morning Emmerich found the boy sitting cross-legged by the tack room with the awl in his hand, working a scrap of harness leather with a concentration so fierce it made Emmerich's chest ache. Nell, who had not cried since the road, began instead to hum. No tune Emmerich recognized, just a low, tuneless comfort sound she made while she trailed him from chore to chore, and he found himself listening for it the way a man listens for rain after a dry summer. He was not, by nature, a demonstrative man. He did not tell them in those first weeks that he had begun rearranging his life around the sound of 3 sets of feet on his floorboards. He only kept feeding them, and kept the fire built high, and one night in the 2nd week he moved his own bed out to the loft above the barn so that the children could have the house's one good room to themselves, and told them it was because he slept better with the horses. Hattie, who missed very little, only looked at him a long moment and said nothing, and set his plate a little fuller than before at the next meal. There were smaller signs, too. the kind a man only notices once he starts looking for them. He began keeping a second lamp lit in the front window after dark, though he could not have said, if asked, who he thought might still be out on the road looking for it. He mended the loose porch step he had stepped over for 6 winters without once fixing, because Nell's small boots had caught on it twice. He found himself talking to Ada's memory less like a man visiting a grave and more like a man giving an account of his days, telling her, in his head, about the almanac readings and the harness leather and the tuneless humming, as though some part of him wanted her to know the house hadn't stayed empty after all. He did not examine that feeling too closely. He only kept the fire built high and the second lamp lit, and let the days accumulate into something that had stopped feeling temporary. The town noticed, as towns do. Palisade Bend was small enough that a bachelor rancher taking in 3 strange children inside of a month could not pass without comment, and the comment eventually reached the ears of Nathaniel Corvin, the circuit judge who rode the territory's probate calendar twice a year and who took, more seriously than most men in his position, the fate of children left without a settled home. Judge Corvin arrived at the Halbrook place on a gray afternoon in late February, driving a hired trap through mud gone half to ice, and he did not waste time on pleasantries. "Mr. Halbrook," he said, standing in the yard with his coat still buttoned, "I've had a letter from the County Asylum Society. 3 children, unrelated to you by blood or marriage, living unsupervised in a bachelor's house. I'll need to see them, and I'll need you to understand the position you've put yourself in." Emmerich understood it well enough. A single man, however well-meaning, was not, in the eyes of the territory's probate code, and more particularly in the eyes of Nathaniel Corvin, a fit household for 3 motherless children. The judge's rule, when he stated it plainly over coffee at Emmerich's own table while Hattie stood rigid in the doorway with Nell's hand gripped in hers, was simple and immovable. A ranch is no place to raise children without a woman in the house, and no bachelor keeps children past the spring session without one. "I'll not have you thinking me cruel for it," Corvin said, not unkindly, though the words landed like stones. "I've seen what happens when good intentions aren't enough. I've seen it in my own family." He did not explain what he meant by that. Not yet. And Emmerich would spend the coming weeks wondering what old wound made a man ride 40 miles in February to take 3 children from the only door that had ever kept them warm. The judge gave him until the spring session, 6 weeks, to either produce a wife or surrender the children to the county asylum in Boise. He said it without relish, the way a man reads a sentence he did not write but is bound to carry out, and then he drove back into the mud and left Emmerich standing in his own yard, with Hattie's hand tight around his sleeve. "You won't let them take us," Dash said that night, the first full sentence Emmerich had heard him speak. "No," Emmerich said, "I won't." He did not, in that moment, know how he would keep the promise. But he had made one promise already, on a night with a cold lantern in a barn, and he had never broken it, and he did not intend to start now. It was Rosalind Fenwick, the widowed schoolteacher who had taken over Palisade Bend's one-room schoolhouse after her husband Aldous died peacefully of a fever 2 winters before, who first suggested that Emmerich fight the ruling rather than simply outrun it. She had begun tutoring Hattie and Dash twice a week that spring, riding out from town with a satchel of primers, and she had watched, in her quiet, observant way, exactly the kind of household Judge Corvin seemed determined not to see. "He's not wrong that children need more than one pair of hands," she told Emmerich one evening, watching Nell fall asleep against his shoulder by the fire. "But he's wrong about what's missing here. There's warmth in this house. I'd swear to that before any judge in the territory." She did swear to it, in the end, not as a bride hastily arranged to satisfy a rule, which both of them agreed from the first would be its own small betrayal of the children's trust, but as a witness, and as a friend of the household who came often enough that her presence in the children's lives became its own quiet, patient fact. What grew between Emmerich and Rosalind grew slowly and without announcement, the way good bread rises, a shared look over the children's heads at supper, an afternoon spent side by side mending fence, while Nell chased a barn cat between them, nothing either of them named aloud until much later. Rosalind brought more than testimony to that house, though she would have been the last to claim credit for it. She brought Hattie a set of her own late husband's books, since the girl had worn the almanac's binding soft with reading, and she brought Dash a proper set of leatherworking tools from the mercantile, paid for out of her own thin schoolteacher's wages, because she had watched him work a scrap of harness with a nail and thought a boy with that much patience deserved better tools than that. She never once suggested to Emmerich that he needed rescuing, or that his household was somehow incomplete without her. She only kept showing up, twice a week and then 3 times, until her absence on the days she didn't come was the thing that felt strange to all 4 of them. Emmerich noticed that Nell had begun saving her a chair at supper without being told to, but it would take more than a school teacher's testimony to change Nathaniel Corvin's mind. It would take a night neither of them could have planned for. The blizzard came in the 2nd week of March, 3 days before the spring session was to open, dropping 2 feet of snow across the county in 18 hours and closing every road between Palisade Bend and the county seat. It caught, among others, the Asylum Society's transport wagon, the very wagon that had been due to carry the Hadley children away if the judge's ruling went against Emmerich, stranded 4 miles from the Halbrook place with its driver, an asylum matron, and 5 other orphaned children being relocated from a played-out logging camp further north. It was Dash, of all of them, who spotted the lantern light struggling through the whiteout from the loft window, and it was Emmerich who saddled a horse into weather no sane man rides into and brought them all back, driver, matron, and 5 frightened, half-frozen children, to a house that had, until that winter, held only one lonely man. Judge Corvin, riding hard to reach Palisade Bend ahead of the storm for the opening of his own session, was caught in the same blizzard and found the Halbrook Ranch the only lit window for 6 miles. He arrived half-frozen himself, and Emmerich took his coat and sat him by the fire without a word about petitions or rulings, and for 3 days, while the storm sealed every road in the county, Judge Nathaniel Corvin lived inside the household he had come to dissolve. He watched Hattie divide the last of the good bread so that the 5 strange children ate before her own brother and sister did. He watched Dash, silent still with most people, teach a frightened logging camp boy how to whittle a wooden horse from a scrap of kindling, working beside him for 2 hours without either child saying more than a dozen words. He watched Nell climb, without being asked, into the lap of the terrified asylum matron and simply sit there, humming her tuneless comfort hum until the woman's shoulders came down from around her ears. And he watched Emmerich Halbrook feed 9 children and 2 grown strangers out of a larder built for 1 man, rationing his own plate down to almost nothing and never once mentioning it, working through each night to keep the fires built high in every room so that no child in his house woke cold. On the 2nd night, unable to sleep, Corvin found Emmerich still awake by the banked fire and sat down across from him without being invited. "My sister's boys were taken from her house in '61, the judge said, to the fire rather than to Emmerich. Our father thought a widow with 3 sons and no income wasn't fit to raise them alone. He was a probate judge himself, and he had the standing to make it so. They went to the asylum in Sacramento. I never learned what became of 2 of them. The 3rd I found again 40 years later, an old man himself by then, and he did not know my name." He was quiet a moment. "I built my whole practice of the law around never letting that happen again on my watch. I thought I was protecting children. I have been so afraid of failing them the way my father failed my nephews that I stopped being able to see the one standing right in front of me. Emmerich said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. The fire cracked, and somewhere upstairs one of the younger children coughed and settled, and Corvin sat with his old grief a while longer in the warm dark. When the roads opened on the fourth morning, Judge Corvin did not wait for the spring session to make his ruling. He gathered the household, Emmerich, Rosalind, Hattie, Dash, Nell, the asylum matron, and all 5 of the stranded children, into the front room, and he stood before them the way he would have stood before his own court, and he spoke plainly and without shame about what he had misjudged. "I came to this house to take 3 children out of it," he said. "I am leaving it certain that no county asylum in this territory could offer them what I have watched them receive here in 4 days under a stranger's roof. The fault in my judgment was mine, and I state that for the record, before this house and no other. Mr. Halbrook, if you'll have me witness it, I intend to file the guardianship papers myself, on your behalf, the moment the roads to the county seat are passable." He paused. "And Mrs. Fenwick, if it isn't out of turn to say so, I'd be glad to witness a second filing when you're both ready for it." Rosalind's cheeks colored, and Emmerich, not a man given to public feeling, found he could not immediately answer, and it was Hattie who broke the silence, stepping forward with Nell's hand still in hers. "We'd like that," she said, simply, "for all of them." The guardianship was formalized that April, with Judge Corvin's own signature on the papers, and he did not stop there. He wrote to the Sacramento Asylum Society himself, reopening the old inquiry into his sister's lost boys, and though he never did find the second, he found the first, an old sheepman living out his years in the Sierra foothills, and the 2 exchanged letters until Corvin's own peaceful death, many years later, in his sleep. Emmerich and Rosalind married the following autumn, in the schoolhouse she had taught in for 2 years, with Hattie standing as witness, and Dash holding the ring in a small tin box he had made himself, and Nell, 5 years old by then, and no longer silent about anything, insisted on carrying flowers she'd picked herself from the last of the season's asters, wilted and a little crooked, and nobody in that room thought them anything less than perfect. Hattie Halbrook grew up to teach at the very schoolhouse where her stepmother once taught her, and lived to be an old woman telling the story to her own grandchildren, seated by a fire in a house not far from the one her father had opened to 3 frozen children on a midnight in 1889. She told it always the same way. At the end, "He didn't know what he was letting in that night," she'd say. "Just 3 cold children, and a debt he never asked for. But some doors, once you open them wide enough, don't rightly close again. Ours never did."